Curious Lloyd.
When moving into a new city, there is a lot of things to consider. Is there a good school system? What's the crime situation? How far is the nearest shopping store? Which type of natural phenomenon is most likely to happen, which they may not always put in the brochures, but plenty of towns and cities have their own regional vintage of apocalypses. An Australian town becomes Spiderville thanks to flooding. Australia is a place where humans have to accept that they are back on the menu. It almost feels like every Aussie animal evolved to savour the taste of British exile blood. But while sharks and crocodiles are content to eat whatever trips into their turf, other species are more ambitious when it comes to claiming territory. Like spiders. Millions and millions of spiders. When the Murrumbidgee River in New South Wales started flooding, towns like Wagga evacuated most residents. However, they weren't the only ones with a contingency plan. In a process called ballooning, the crab spiders use long strands of its silky web to travel through the air. They set out on this airborne journey when they mature and start to feel stifled by tens of thousands of siblings they have to compete with. So when a flood threatened the habitat of these several spidey clans, they all strapped on their self-made parachutes and migrated to wherever the current took them, which turned out to be Wagga. And on May the 4th, 2015, the remaining residents of New South Wales woke up to find millions of crab spiders paratrooping into their village. Before long, entire villages were covered in spiderwebs so massive that they looked like they were designed to catch dinosaurs. Luckily, these spiders are one of few Australian arachnids that can't kill somebody just by looking at them. The younglings can't even break the skin with their bites. Like any adolescents, their nuisance was mainly TPing a bunch of houses and loitering outside and around in large groups. But still, we have to admire the Australians for their casual reaction of the slightest annoyance to this phenomenon, because most of the people who would see a cloud of spiders raining down on them would probably burn the country to the ground and try again elsewhere. Dublin was nearly burnt down by a flaming river of whiskey. Of all the places, Ireland would probably be the least surprised if whiskey started streaming through the streets like it was part of the natural environment. The only thing they would have to worry about would be the biggest collective hangover since the day before. But in 1875, Dubliners found out that the national spirit could damage more than their livers when an actual river of the good stuff came rushing through their city, setting everything on fire. Right after 8 p.m, on June the 18th, 1875, people noticed flames in one area of the town. The cause was quickly ascertained, as 1,800 barrels worth of flaming whiskey came pouring through the city. Onlookers compared it to a stream of lava. The single malt stream set fire to everything it touched, and left people fleeing for their lives. A healthy amount of Dubliners didn't want to waste the free booze though, so even while fleeing, some people couldn't help but try and capture the precious liquid before it went to waste, in anything they could, including hats and boots. At first, firefighters tried putting it out with water, but mixing whiskey and water only made it worse, and the fire spread even faster. Fortunately, like every other city in the 1800s, Dublin had literally tons of manure lying around, which they used to build dams to stop the fire from moving through the streets, halting the streams enough for the fire brigade to douse them. It wasn't until the day after that things had calmed enough for people to return to their homes and assess the damage. The Great Whiskey Fire was one of Dublin's most destructive blazes ever. The police and fire departments were praised for their amazing response time, as if it was almost as if they had arrived at the river of booze before anyone else had reported it was on fire. Amazingly, not a single Dubliner died from the fire or smoke. 13 of them did die from chugging burning gutter whiskey, which remained poisonous even in the hardened stomachs of the 19th century Irish alcoholics. Wanggrata is buried under tumbleweed. Yes, it's Australia again. What a surprise. In the Darwinian nightmare that is down under, even the weeds can challenge us for dominance. The evocatively named hairy panic, or Panicum effusum, is the mass buildup of dried bush, like giant fuzzy tumbleweeds, which sounds all quaint and rustic because of increasingly dry weather. It's just dead grass, although it fortunately doesn't cause wildfires. It only took a single farmer forgetting to secure his derelict padlock for wavy hairy panic to fuzz over the Australian city of Wanggrata. The plant which makes the tumbleweed is so fast growing that the tumbleweeds can easily stack up to roof height, with some residents having to remove them multiple times a day. After numerous complaints, the local council had to admit that they couldn't do anything to stop the invasion, other than hope for a strong wind to carry the tumbleweed over to the next town. A spokesperson told a newspaper that there wasn't much that could be done from an enforcement side of things, that the council had a very limited capacity to intervene, and that it was not something they can stop from happening. But while the weeds are relatively harmless to people and pets, they are very poisonous to sheep, causing swelling of the head, jaundice, and liver damage. or as the Australians call it, yellow big head, because you need to create as much whimsy as possible when living in a place where Mother Nature tries to bounce you on a daily basis. London was buried under a poisonous smog. It turns out that London never really suffered from fog, as it had a really bad smog problem, like modern day industrial China bad. Yet for centuries, Londoners would grit their teeth, which is what smog does to the teeth, and welcome the change of pace from inhaling pipe tobacco and horse manure particles all day long. But in December 1952, everything got taken to a whole new level, as the smog started choking people to death. The Great Smog was a perfect storm. During one of the country's harshest winters, more fires had been lit than ever before, producing a troublesome amount of smoke and coal dust. At the same time, above the city, a weather phenomenon called an anticyclone had formed, keeping fresh air out of the area. Before long, visibility dropped to a few foot. 2 days later, it was 1 foot. Since no one could see, cars had to be abandoned in the middle of the road and people fell into the Thames and drowned. Then the pollution started mixing with the water in the air, turning into sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, and making the air toxic to breathe. Since ambulances couldn't get out, people had to walk to the hospitals, with their lips turning blue from asphyxiation along the way. Within a week's time, 12,000 people had died, but the government were very embarrassed that they had ignored those crazy pre-hippie environmentalists who protested in the 1920s, and insisted that most of the dead had merely caught a really bad flu. New York City streets were littered with horse manure and carcasses. These days, getting around New York City is a nightmare. The streets might as well be car parks, and even the public transportation is one of those annoyances New Yorkers never stop complaining. About the only pleasant means of transportation left are those lovely carriage rides around Central Park. So imagine how much more beautiful it must have been when everyone was using horses to get around. Well, are you picturing flies, dust, and huge piles of manure? But that accurately happened to 1800s in New York City. As the population of New York City skyrocketed in the 19th century, 100,000 to 200,000 horses were brought to the Big Apple to transport this steaming heap of humanity. What people didn't keep in mind was that each of these equine convertibles produced 15 to 30 pounds of poop a day, plus a quarter of urine. That waste was spread all over the city for pedestrians to try, and usually failed to avoid it. But what they could never avoid was the gigantic cloud of manure that coated the city like a disgusting Ferrero Rocher look. But the living horses were not the biggest waste management problem the city faced, although that would be the dead ones. It was a commonplace for horses to get sick or collapse from overwork. In 1880 alone, New York City had to deal with 15,000 horse corpses littering its streets, and if a particularly heavy specimen keeled over in Broadway, then it was easier to let it stay there until it had rotted enough that it could be taken away piece by piece. The smell of decay wasn't just unbearable, it was also lethal. About 20,000 people a year died from livestock-related illnesses, which, if you're keeping count, means that more people than horses died from horse sickness. Eventually, the city decided that something had to be done. They came up with an ingenious plan, which was to clean up the mountains of crap from time to time. It's amazing how it only took them about a century to figure out that amazing idea. The city created a new curious governmental branch called the Department of Sanitation and sent men completely dressed in white to sweep the streets. Shockingly, these white wings really helped turn around the city's health problem. Here's a comparison of the two streets before and after people decided to start picking up their crap. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week. Boots and cats and boots and cats and hats and boots and cats. That's how you beatbox. Boots and cats and boots and cats.